So this lecture, what I'd like to talk about is what makes science science, particular as seen through the eyes of an Austrian philosopher who's one of the most influential of last century, namely Karl Popper. And what he is famous for and what he was interested in is what's been called the demarcation criterion, which means demarking or separating science from non-science, or good science and bad science. And he wasn't interested in just the label science, but in the substantive question of what makes knowledge grow. How do we find out about the world, including the mind? So let me start with a little exercise. So I'm going to consider something called terror management theory, which is a long-standing theory within social psychology. Popper himself didn't consider this theory, but I'll be illustrating a very Popperian point with this example. So the idea of the theory, which incidentally one can trace back about 2,300 years to Epicurus, who argued that a fear of death motivates a lot of unhealthy behaviour in people, perhaps unconsciously. And that's exactly the notion picked up by terror management theory, that if you get someone to think about death, maybe, for example, experimental manipulation they have is to write a little essay about your own death, that induces terror. But we don't like that terror, so we do something to deal with it. The way we can deal with it can happen unconsciously, that we're not aware of that terror once the initial surge of fear has died down from writing the essay. It goes into our unconsciousness, but nonetheless influences us, and we still have to deal with it. And the way we deal with it is to try and restore self-esteem, or to associate ourselves with something bigger than ourselves, like our culture, and support the tenets of our culture, to become more conservative, in other words, to endorse views that are consistent with the worldview of the group to which we belong, maybe because that's something bigger than us, and in that sense, semi-immortal, at least compared to us. And so we get a sort of, we partake in its immortality by that process. So that's the idea, and the experimental manipulation, as I said, is often to get people to think about death as the experimental condition, and a control group would think about something else, maybe something frightening, maybe something neutral, but not death in any case. And then you can ask questions about how will that affect people. So I found two papers that consider the question, how would that affect a person wanting to have sex with different people? Now, one notion, which goes back a couple of thousand years, is maybe it made you want to have more children, and thereby have your immortality through your children. This paper didn't quite argue it in those terms, but more in the sort of strictly terror management theory terms, saying that if you prime mortality, which means, let's say, writing this essay about your own death, in men, they'd want to bolster their self-esteem by sort of buying into the group view, as these authors saw it, that men have higher self-esteem the more partners that they have. And so, therefore, priming death should make men want more partners and want to be more risky with those partners as well. That's the prediction they derived from terror management theory, and indeed, in a set of 3 experiments, the prediction was confirmed. But then I found this other paper, whose authors included the originators of terror management theory, who argued in this way that sex reminds you of us as sort of physical, corporeal beings. Being reminded of our physical nature reminds us of death. And so if you've primed terror of death, the last thing we want to think about is our physical corporeal nature, and so we try and avoid sex They said, therefore, men would be less attracted to sexual temptation, particularly with, as they put it, alluring women. And indeed, in sort of experiments, that's exactly what they found. So, none of those papers referenced each other, incidentally, which I thought was curious. But reflecting on that pattern, what do you think of the following argument? Terror management theory is a good theory because one can explain all patterns of results. Namely, one can explain a mortality prime making men either more or less interested in sex with many partners, or indeed no change at all if those factors balanced out. So because we can explain everything, it's really a pretty good theory. What I'd like you to do is to just discuss with the person next to you what do you think of that statement, that conclusion that I've written on the page there. So let me put it in Popperian terms. Unless a theory were falsifiable, how could you find out from observation of nature, how could you get any feedback from nature that you were wrong? So in this case, if the theory predicts everything, there's nothing that shows you were wrong, that the theory was wrong, I should say. So the theory, as stated so far by me, is not falsifiable. There's no set of results that would say, you got that wrong. But if there's nothing that tells you when you make a mistake and you got something wrong, there's no way you can learn from nature. There's no way you can learn from observation. So what Popper said is, that's precisely the demarcation between science and non-science, is in science you put forward a falsifiable theory. A theory that doesn't explain everything. That's precisely what it doesn't do when it's science. It says, these possible observations cannot occur. And if they do occur, the theory must be wrong. Does that make sense? So, and not only do you need the falsifiable theory, but to really make that work, you need a community of scientists who are actively seeking to falsify it. Then we're in business of science. But Popper didn't think that just because something wasn't a science, that it was therefore somehow invalid or nonsense. It could be a perfectly good idea. In fact, it could be a true idea. In fact, it strikes me as rather plausible that fear of death motivates people in all sorts of ways. What we need to do to turn the idea from just sort of being some idea into a scientific theory is to specify the certain conditions in which we predict this, but under other conditions we'll get it the other way. So you just need a bit more work to do on terror management theory. For all I know, those terror management people theory can do this, to say, and these are the conditions in which we predict it going one way, and these are the conditions in which you can predict it going another way. Then we have science, right? Now, the criterion of falsifiability isn't black and white. It's not as if something is either purely science or purely non-science, but there are degrees of falsifiability you can have. So these are some statements from Popper which express that notion and have sort of become part of the bones of experimental psychologists. These are just feelings that the experimental psychologist has without necessarily knowing that they were put in this way by Popper quite a long time ago. So he says the content of the theory, or its empirical content, increases with its degree of falsifiability. The more a theory forbids, the more it says about the world. A theory that forbids many outcomes is easy to falsify, so it says a lot about the world. Theory that allows everything explains nothing. So let me illustrate. All of those claims are really saying the same thing. And I could illustrate that. So a theory of hurricanes. let's say you want to go to Florida at some time, but you know hurricanes sometimes go there, and you don't want to go during some intense hurricane. So there's two theories on the market, let's say, and this one says there is a hurricane that's going to land in Florida sometime between, say, Monday of this week to Sunday, and there will be some degree of intensity all the way from just a mild wind to a fully fledged hurricane. So basically it says almost anything can happen. But there's another theory that says it will be on Tuesday between this time, 9 in the morning and 9 at night especially, that will have a hurricane of this force between this amount and this amount. So it's predicting precisely, I don't know what you measure hurricanes in, but the strength of the hurricane relatively precisely at a relatively precise time. Now, let's say in fact what happens is you do get a hurricane on the Tuesday in the time period indicated, so it's consistent with both theories. So neither theory has been falsified, because what you have is an observation that's consistent with both. But this theory here rules out a lot. If the hurricane had come on the Wednesday, it would have said, well, that shouldn't have happened, so therefore the theory is false, right? So there's a lot here that would, a lot of possible observations that would falsify the theory, so it has a high degree of falsifiability. Whereas here, there's almost nothing that will falsify that theory. So it's a low degree of falsifiability. Now, given that that's happened, how would you plan your trips in future? Would you use theory 1 or theory 2? I don't know if you have a preference. Maybe tell the person next to you the preference of theory 1 or theory 2. So theory 2 was highly falsifiable and made a very precise prediction and got it right. Theory 1 was not very falsifiable. It still got things right, but that's because it gets everything right. Okay? Whatever happens, it says, yeah, I told you so. Huh? Theory 2, that's right. So what Popper said is so that's your intuition, and Popper said that's right. It's entirely rational to choose a theory that's more falsifiable. So you should prefer the more falsifiable theory. That's what you do. That's what we should be doing as scientists. And what that also means, to make our theories bold and interesting, we should be trying to make them as falsifiable as possible. So in some ways, maybe, I don't know if that sort of seems maybe self-evident when you put it like that, but just check yourself when you do your dissertation, when you're coming up with a theory. Are you really setting up conditions in which you think the theory could be false? And for different patterns of results, is your mind working away trying to tell yourself how you would explain that within the terms of your theory? Or are you really setting up conditions in which you would say, no, I'd give up this really interesting theory if I got these results? Another example. So here's a claim that has been made that in human beings the medial prefrontal cortex is required for theory of mind. Theory of mind meaning the process by which we understand other people's minds. For example, we understand the conditions under which they might have false beliefs, and we understand, we think about their desires, beliefs, motivations, and so on, so that we can predict what other people might do and say and behave. So that's theory of mind. And so I put up this theory here that a certain bit of the brain is responsible and required for us to perform theory of mind tasks, for us to engage in understanding other people's minds. So this study, one of the earlier ones using brain imaging, had people perform either a theory of mind task in which they had to think about what other people are thinking about, or they had to just think about physical events that were happening. And then when you contrast those two conditions, you get the medial prefrontal cortex showing activation. So, what I just want you to say to the person next to you, do you think that this result has established that the theory is true? In the sense of established beyond sort of reasonable doubt, as it were, that we can go home now and say, yep, that's that theory shown to be true, let's move on to something else. So have we established that the theory is true? Just tell the person next to you what you think. Okay, any answers? Just yes or no will do. Just hand up if you think yes, you've established the theory. No? Right, so most people are saying no to that, and that's what I would think. I think it would be a bit strong to say we've established the theory. It sort of supports the theory, but we'd want a bit more evidence before we would go home and say, solve that problem, let's move on to something else now. All right, so let's get a bit more evidence. Let's say we found, for example, you might say what the brain imaging shows is that area is involved in some way, but it doesn't show that it's necessary for theory of mind. So let's say you find a patient with frontal damage due to head injury, that medial prefrontal cortex was damaged, and that person was, you found, below average on theory of mind tasks. Have you established the theory? Well, not yet. So there was one person who was impaired on theory of mind and had impaired medial prefrontal functioning, but that's one person. It doesn't mean that in human beings this area is required for theory of mind, right? All right, so this paper here, these are genuine results and ideas I'm talking about. They found 19 patients with frontal lesions and some other patients were a sort of a matched control group that had non-frontal lesions. And the frontal patients were relatively impaired on theory of mind compared to the non-frontal ones. Have we established the theory is true that this region of the brain is required in human beings for theory of mind? Just tell the person next to you a yes or a no.
We obviously there are other factors that can like yeah, we could establish it. They compare it to non-frontal lesions I mean, yeah.
Now, consider this, and what I've said so far is all, as I say, I haven't made this up, as it were. It's just to make some funny example. Now, consider this paper by Chris Bird, a researcher at Sussex, you might know. He found one patient with extensive damage to the frontal lobes on both sides, including those putative theory of mind areas, and her performance on theory of mind tasks was just normal. So, even given everything that I've said before, is the medial prefrontal cortex required in human beings for theory of mind tasks? No. Okay. So, given we accept experiments well done, they measure theory of mind and those sorts of things, which we have to accept in the other cases as well, that kind of settles the matter, doesn't it? It refutes the theory. So this is the way Popper put it: no amount of evidence ever shows a general theory is true. It can support a theory, but you never conclusively establish a scientific theory. But evidence can show a theory is false, as long as we accept the assumptions that go into the evidential claims, which is something we'll come to in the seminar. But the assumption, but given we accept those assumptions, that is true for whether it's supporting the theory or going against the theory. And they're then, given we accept the assumptions that go into the evidence, there is this asymmetry in that a single counterexample, a single good counterexample like the one I just described here, refutes a theory in a way that positive evidence never shows that it's true. So, actually, we should be happy when a theory is falsified, because then we've learned a lot. We learn more from negative evidence than positive evidence. So what you should be doing when you're, say, thinking about a dissertation, thinking about science, thinking about what would show that this theory is wrong, and go out and look for such evidence. And part of Popper's position is to separate yourself from the theory. He says theories have their own objective reality or existence, quite independent from you and your mental states. So what that means is when you falsify a theory, it's not like you're falsifying yourself. You falsify the theory. And that's great, because now you can come up with another theory, a better theory. Better in that it can explain the results of falsified past theories. So Popper said what we should be doing is specifying in advance the conditions under which a theory would be falsified. Now it seems, because sort of psychologists intuitively accept this, that this is what every paper goes about doing. It says we make these predictions and it looks like they could be false. But is that really what's going on? And there are indications that that isn't what has been going on. It's been a sort of a facade, if you like. And one of the recent indications of this that helped trigger a process of radical reform that we're going to mention is this paper by Simmons et al. What they did was to simulate a case where there actually were no effects. There were no differences between groups. But what you have in reality in an experiment, even if there are no sort of population differences, there's noise, because you're just taking a sample from the population, and samples are randomly a bit bigger and a bit smaller than the true population value, so there's always noise there. Your sample in one condition can be a bit different from the sample in another condition, just because of the vagaries of random sampling. So they did this random sampling, but with the computer simulation, so everything is under their control. When you say you're testing at a significance level of 5%, in other words, you look at p less than 0.05 on your SPSS output, and you get very excited when you get that, because you're then allowed to say there is a difference. What that means is, if there really was no difference, in 5% of cases you'd say there is a difference. That's the level of error you're declaring you're happy with when you accept a significance level of 5%. Okay, so that's fine. It doesn't matter what that level is, it can be anything. We've set them at 5%, fine. But now, what happens to that error rate under different sort of, ways of analysing the data? So let's say you had two dependent variables that you thought roughly measured the same thing. Say you measured altruism in a couple of different ways. And, but you had the choice, depending on if one of those measures came out p less than 0.05, you could select that and just ignore the other one when you come to write up your paper. Or you could select the other one, or you could average the two together. Now you've got a bit more flexibility, you see. So you've got a bit more ability to capitalise on noise. And so you're more likely to make a false positive conclusion, because you're giving yourself more chances to say, yes, there is something there. So you can see here, if you use p less than 0.05, the actual error rate goes up to about 10% of those conditions. If you have two dependent variables, and you allow yourself to pick either of them, or a combination of the two, even though you're saying you're using significance level 5%, your actual error rate is 10%. Or you might say, you run the number of subjects you plan to run. Oh, it's not quite significant. P equals 0.08. Why don't we go out and run 10 more subjects? And then we'll check again. If you allow yourself to do that, you've got a bit more wiggle room, you see. You're giving yourself another roll of the dice, another chance to capitalise on noise, so your error rate has to be a bit bigger. And indeed it is. Just a single chance of running 10 more subjects per cell, the error rate goes up to that 8% instead of the normal 5. You might say, let's put in gender as a covariate, or as just a factor to see if it, it's as a factor to see if it interacts. We'll see if it makes a difference or not, and you feel free to put it in the analysis or take it out of the analysis, just depending on the results. There's a bit more noise. The noise sort of goes in slightly different directions depending on what you do, so you're giving yourself another chance to capitalise on noise. Or you might have 3 conditions and you say, I don't know, 3 different ways of stressing people. And you're free to drop one of them because you say, oh, that didn't, why did I ever think that would be a great way of stressing people? I'll drop that one if it doesn't come out. Now, the frightening thing is, in some ways, it's sort of obvious that when you give yourself extra shots of something, you're going to increase the error rate. But what was interesting about this paper is just how high the error rate goes with these simple things, these simple degrees of freedom, as they became named. If you give yourself all 4 of those opportunities, the error rate goes up to 61%. In other words, even if there's nothing going on, in over 60% of the time, you'll declare a significant result and there was something there, there was a difference there. So that's how easy it is to manufacture a result out of thin air when there's nothing going on. So is it a problem? Do people do these things? So in this paper, John et al., they asked psychologists whether they did these things like them, whether they know anybody else who did them, and also what percentage of researchers do they think would admit to doing them if they were doing them. These are the results. So failing to report all your variables, your dependent variables, about 80% of researchers said that they'd done that at some time. And they estimated roughly the same percent of other researchers did that. What this light grey bar is then adjusting this figure in the light of, for example, they said that they thought only 50% of people would admit doing it. Well, we can double their estimates, you see, if we take into account that admission rate to get the true underlying rate. And that's what this estimate is. It's taking into account their estimates of whether you admit, what percentage of people would admit doing it. So it's virtually 100% of researchers, estimated, have engaged in measuring a variable in several different ways and then not reporting all of those dependent variables, just picking the ones that look good, as it were. You see, it's easy to, they call these questionable research practices because that's not outright lying. And it's easy to come up with an explanation for yourself why that measure, well, of course, that measure would do the job, right? Whatever possessed me to think this other one would be as good. You see, it's easy to spin stories after the fact in the light of the results for why a particular measure is a good one and therefore report that. And none of these people lied in their papers when they were doing that. They were just reporting what they thought was the cleanest, best measures. Collecting more data after seeing whether results are significant is a similar pattern, and so on. Failing to report all conditions. So these are the things, if we put them together, we can manufacture evidence out of thin air. Now, I suppose reassuringly, outright falsifying data, very few researchers said they'd ever done that. As I say, this is why it's called a questionable research practice, because, at least back in those days, people weren't aware just how bad it was to do these things. It's not as if they're lying, it's not as if they weren't doing legitimate statistics, it's not as if they're reporting anything false, they were just sort of selectively reporting some analyses and some variables. So it seems there's a potential for a problem there. Is there any evidence this has created a problem? Well, I think we have very good evidence that there really is a problem, as shown by the reproducibility project spearheaded by Brian Nosek. So roughly 100 studies were taken from 2008 from high prestige journals in psychology, and direct replications of them were crowdsourced to the community of psychologists and said, could you try and replicate one of these studies as closely as possible? And so that's what they have, is what ended up with in this science paper in 2015. Now, if there was really no effects going on in there, and they did these replications, then 5% of studies would be significant, because that's what 5% means. That's what 5% significant means. If there's nothing going on, you're going to say yes 5% of the time. That's the false positive rate. Now, if all the effects were there, it doesn't mean you pick up with them every time. Whether you pick up an effect or not, it's called the power of the study, which is something you can work out. It depends on the number of subjects that you have. The more subjects you have, the more power you have. So the average power of these studies was 92%. That means if in 100% of cases there really was a population effect there, 92% of them would be significant. So the actual result is going to be somewhere between 5% and 92%. I don't know what you guess the replication rate was. It's about a third. So I take that to be indicative that there's a real problem here. Yes, some effects replicated, but 2/3 did not with high-powered studies. Now, high-powered meaning studies able to pick up by and large effects that really are there. So what's the solution? Well, the Popperian solution is to be clear in advance what will count against the theory. For example, specifying the exact analyses that you're going to do. So you're not free to say, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this, and then pick the one that gets the result that you want. And also, because theories, data, materials have an objective existence of their own, they should all be transparent. In other words, publicly available, so that we can look for errors. Analytic flexibility, in other words, being able to use different analytic procedures, different sorts of statistics, stopping data collection at different times, allows you to use many patterns of results. So if you make your exact choices of analyses after the data are collected, guided by, even if implicitly, and not terribly consciously, by what results, what p-value they give you, you don't really have very falsifiable set of conditions, right? You don't have conditions that will make your theory highly falsified. So there's now a movement in which what you do is your paper gets accepted by a journal before you've collected the data. By specifying in the introduction the theory you're testing, how you're going to test it, and the exact, precisely nailed down analytic protocol you're going to use. Because that's what science should depend upon. It shouldn't depend upon whether you got p less than 0.05 or not. It shouldn't depend on the answer nature gives you. It should depend on only you ask the probing question with a probing method. And then the answer is up to nature. So in registered reports, you get accepted before the data are in, and then the data come out however they come out. Could be significant, could be non-significant, doesn't matter. And then we get a less biased view of what's really going on. Once you've got the paper accepted, in terms of just its methods, introduction, motivation, and analytic protocol, you're virtually guaranteed your publication. The other movement that's going on is to make sure your data, your raw data, is uploaded on a public repository, like the Open Science Framework. If you Google OSF, you can get that. and your materials and your computer programs are uploaded. So anybody can go through that, check analyses, check different analyses, check your materials, and check it for errors. So I'm part of, well, I've signed up to this peer reviewers openness initiative. When I review a paper, if they haven't put the data online, publicly available, I say, I can't accept this paper. Either the data go up there, or they give a good reason why not, otherwise I can't continue with the review. So more and more people are signing up to this initiative, and more journals are demanding open data. So the more transparent the data materials are, the more falsifiable is the theory, because the more errors can be checked and tested by other people. So this is what Popper said: bold ideas, unjustified anticipations, and speculative thought are our only means for interpreting nature. The way you generate a theory is up to you. There's no way of generating a theory, you just make a guess. But then, once you've guessed your theory, you have to expose it to the hazard of refutation. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not taking part in the game of science. So ask yourself this when it comes to your dissertation: how would you know if your favourite theory were wrong? Sounds ever so simple, but as I say, when you really get down to doing it yourself, you'll find your own mind playing tricks on you. So keep reminding yourself of this question, and ask your supervisor: will the data and materials be transparent? Will they be uploaded, publicly available for anybody to check for any wrongdoing, any mistakes, and so on? And the other thing you can do is pre-register what you're going to do online in OSF. All you do is you put up a document saying, this is how I'm going to analyse the data, these are my predictions, and these are the analyses. All of that will help make your work more falsifiable. Right, thanks very much, and I'll see you next week to talk about flourish.